of the school. In 1984, he was named headmaster of the whole high school, which had moved out from Garrison Street. And 4 years ago, he stepped down as headmaster and was named provost of the high school. We figure no one really knows what a provost does, and no one really knows what Joe does. Except we do know he is very accomplished and has been a significant part, probably the most important part, of the high school. He's leaving us this year to become the headmaster of the American school in Switzerland, and he's taking a few teachers with him. Although R.J. Hawley has promised to come back in 2 years so that we can have an internationally renowned college counselor at the Heights. Welcome, Joseph W. McPherson.
Thank you. My parents promised me a dog if the next sibling born after my 4 sisters, 2 of whom are here today, if the next sibling was also a girl, and then Rich came along. And so I always felt somewhat ambivalent about him. But I would have gone through many dogs to replace Rich. And, I've reconciled myself to it. Parents, families, and friends of the class of 2001, esteemed colleagues at the Heights School, gentlemen of the graduating class. A few weeks ago, I came across this quote of the British historian C.V. Wedgwood. History is lived forwards, but it is written in retrospect. We know the end before we consider the beginning, and we can never wholly recapture what it was to know the beginning only. As I usually do when I come across an interesting idea, I try to test it against the reality of my own experience. And I found myself thinking back on that thin slice of history of which I've been privileged to be a part. Specifically, I thought back to the origins of this school on this campus. In 1978, the physical appearance of this place seemed like what the Dutch sailors of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby saw when they first encountered the fresh green breast of the New World, whose beauty compelled them into an aesthetic contemplation they neither understood nor desired. My son James, who's a teacher here now, almost 4 years old then, remarked that was the only school he'd seen in the woods. I find it odd that I can remember no imaginative projection of how the campus would develop, how the forests would vanish as new buildings and parking lots and new fields and courts would be added, how everything around the school would get built up. Virgil's Aeneas, after his arduous journey from Troy to Italy, was given divine aid to foresee the layout and physical greatness that the city his descendants were to found would have. His guide pointed out the various features that the empty landscape would someday possess, features that Virgil's contemporary readers, and even we today, would recognize. I had no such divine aid and no such vision. I realize now that the reason for this is that the buildings and facilities are not the true school, but only means, important means, but means nevertheless. Nor 23 years ago, speaking for myself, did I envision how difficult it would be for us to get the money for the facilities we have and still need, nor how difficult it would be to attract students as the biggest demographic trough since the Great Depression marched at steady pace through the 1980s and 1990s. Nor did I see the misunderstandings that some people would have of the school, nor the unrealistic expectations that others would have. In any case, if I and those with whom I worked had known, we surely might have hesitated. But I do not think we would have been completely daunted, and that is because we had an ideal for the school, a sense that something great could be accomplished. Rome had an ideal when it was but a tiny village of huts along the Tiber River. That ideal propelled it forward to greatness. For the idea of Rome was something that turned enemies into allies, allies into friends, and finally into Romans. Ideals really do drive history. As in our lifetime, we saw in Poland, when a Polish pope urged his countrymen not to use violence, but to live in truth, an ideal that ultimately toppled the Soviet Union. The Heights had an ideal, and this has been the driving force of its development. That ideal had its origins in the founder of Opus Dei's teachings on the importance of ordinary work and the details of everyday life. To do the ordinary things extraordinarily well for the love of God was how Blessed Josemaria Escriva sometimes phrased it. As that applied to the school, we found various formulations, such as, the school exists to help parents form their sons into the type of young men they would like to see their daughters marry. Another formulation I came up with rather serendipitously. I was at a headmaster's conference, and at the beginning of the conference, the 60 or so of us there were broken up into groups of 10, where we were each supposed to describe our respective schools in just 3 words. In my group, it seemed rather like group dinner orders at a Chinese restaurant, where you pick one entree from column A, another from column B, and another from column C, where A was nurturing, caring, warm, supportive. Column B was diverse, multicultural, inclusive, open. Column C was challenging, learning is fun, said fast to suggest hyphens so that they get within the one-word rule, hands-on, etc. I came near the end of my group and said, the Heights is academic, masculine, and cheerful. This was met by nervous giggles, for it seemed clear that I had committed an oxymoron, possibly 3 oxymorons. In any case, the small group session had served its purpose of revealing who should be marginalized in succeeding sessions. But I liked the succinctness and the aptness of it and repeated it a number of times at the school when I returned. These were in fact the qualities that we have tried to view in these young men whom we have before us today. Allow me to briefly go over each one. Academic. That 165 advanced placement exams were administered a couple of weeks ago should be enough to indicate that the Heights has a serious commitment to academics. But what makes the Heights different is that academic achievement is not seen merely as a means of building a resume, of getting ahead, a phenomenon that author David Brooks reported as widespread among current Princeton undergraduates in a recent cover story in the Atlantic Monthly. Interestingly enough, I saw the one person he quoted in the article who said went against this trend is one of our graduates, and he's standing over here. At the Heights, we have tried to inculcate a sense that academics is a means to develop oneself for becoming a better professional. That is, someone capable of serving his fellow man through work. The motto of the school is crescite, which means grow or increase, and which is actually the first word God says to mankind in Genesis, and later to Noah after the flood. The beginning of that injunction, increase and multiply, fill the earth and make it yours, or have dominion over it. The last phrase is the difference between God's injunction to the plants, God's injunction to the animals, and so indicative of the vocation of human beings. Work is a positive and fundamental dimension of our humanity. Education should be seen as a means of developing that dimension.